Title: Unseen Shadows, Chapter 1, A Strange Shift. The day began as any other, but for Violet, there was something unsettling in the air. She couldn't quite place it, a chill that lingered too long, shadows that felt a little too close, and a silence that seemed to press down on her. The world outside her window was still the same, the pale light of morning casting a soft glow over the familiar streets. The hum of traffic a distant murmur, but as she dressed, a feeling crept over her, a nagging thought that she was somehow out of sync with everything around her. When she arrived at school, Violet tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the gloom of winter, or a poor night's sleep. But it was only the beginning. As she walked down the hall, a classmate she'd known since childhood brushed past her without a glance. Her friend Emma, who she usually met every morning by the lockers, was there, laughing with a group of people. But Violet wasn't part of the scene. She reached out, hesitated, and then called her friend's name. Emma turned, her face blank for a moment before recognition sparked in her eyes. "Oh, hey, Violet," she said with a distant smile, as if they were casual acquaintances rather than best friends. The interaction felt wrong, off-kilter. Violet let the encounter go, chalking it up to morning distraction, yet the hollowness in Emma's greeting lingered in her mind. The fraying edges of reality. As the day went on, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. In class, Violet noticed how often her classmates' eyes seemed to pass over her, sliding across her as if she were part of the background. She'd answer questions, participate, but sometimes the teacher would move on, barely acknowledging her. Even during lunch, where she usually sat with a close-knit group, there was a strange distance in her friends' glances, a vague inattentiveness in their conversations with her. The longer she observed, the more she noticed the oddities. It was as if she were slowly becoming transparent, part of the room rather than part of their lives. And for the first time, she felt a tinge of fear, a small creeping dread that wormed its way into her thoughts. In a rush of desperation, Violet tried to force herself into the conversation at lunch, cracking jokes, asking about their weekends. Her friends responded, but their laughter felt hollow, their answers short. She saw them share looks when they thought she wasn't watching, puzzled expressions that seemed to ask, "Who is she again?" It felt impossible, ridiculous. She knew these people, had been with them for years. But as her friends' faces grew vague and indifferent, she couldn't help but feel she was the only one who remembered. The mirror's subtle deception. That night, after a day that left her feeling strangely fatigued and disconnected, Violet stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her own reflection. The face that looked back at her was familiar. Dark hair falling over one shoulder, eyes slightly too large, with a faint scar along her jaw from an accident as a child. But something felt off. A tiny, almost imperceptible difference that she couldn't pinpoint. The bathroom was quiet, the hum of the fan the only sound. But Violet's heartbeat grew loud in her ears. She stared deeper, her eyes following the curve of her face, the line of her lips. A trick of the light, she told herself. But the longer she looked, the more she felt a strange dissonance, as though the reflection was a split second behind, her movements almost delayed. "Get a grip, Violet," she muttered to herself, turning away. But the reflection lingered in her thoughts as she climbed into bed, that nagging feeling of something slipping out of her reach, growing stronger with each passing moment. An unusual silence. The following day, things only worsened. Her mother forgot to wake her up for school, something that had never happened before. Violet hurried downstairs, annoyed and confused, but her mother seemed flustered, almost shocked to see her. "Oh, Violet, I didn't hear you get up," her mother stammered, looking past her for a moment before her eyes focused on her with a strange look of surprise. Breakfast was tense. Violet's father sat across from her, distracted by the morning news, barely glancing her way. Her mother's silence was louder than usual, and every attempt Violet made to break it was met with a distant nod or a delayed response. The familiar warmth of her family home felt foreign, cold, as though she were a guest instead of their daughter. At school, the sense of disorientation grew worse. Friends she'd known for years greeted her with lukewarm smiles, as if they were meeting her for the first time. She started to feel an ache, a heavy pressure in her chest as though she were losing her place in their lives, slipping through some unseen crack. A lost photograph. Desperate for a connection to something real, Violet dug through her bag, looking for an old group photo she always carried. It was a picture taken last summer, showing her and her friends on the last day of school, arms around each other, laughing. She pulled it out, her hands shaking slightly, and froze. Her image was missing. Where she should have been standing, there was only the faintest outline, a blur that suggested she had once been there but had somehow faded. The faces of her friends looked normal, but her own was nothing more than a shadow, a hint of a person who had once belonged. She stared at the photo, her heart pounding. The realization hit her with a cold, sharp clarity. I'm being erased, she thought. The idea was absurd, impossible, yet she couldn't deny what she was seeing. She felt her fingers tremble as she clutched the photograph, the ghostly outline of her own face staring back at her, an echo of who she was. The halls around her seemed to stretch, each step taking her further from reality. Her friends drifted by, laughing, chatting, but their faces grew blurrier, their voices fainter. Violet felt as if she were walking through a dream, a place where she didn't belong. She was fading, slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The loneliness of shadows. By the end of the day, Violet felt hollow, like a shadow cast by someone else. Her footsteps felt too light, her reflection in windows too faint. When she spoke, her voice seemed to echo as if from a distance, bouncing off walls that didn't recognize her. She had the creeping sense that her world had shifted, leaving her stranded between reality and some silent void that no one else could see. That night, she lay awake, feeling the weight of her own disappearance. She tried to tell herself it was all in her head, a series of strange coincidences, but the faded photograph and her friends' blank faces haunted her, filling her thoughts with fear. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes wide, feeling as if the darkness around her was closing in, swallowing her whole. As she drifted into a restless sleep, she dreamed of a world where she walked alone, the streets empty, her reflection absent from every surface. Shadows lingered at the edges of her vision, silent and watchful, as if waiting for her to step into their embrace. And in the distance, a voice whispered her name, a soft, forgotten echo that faded before she could grasp it. When she awoke the next morning, she felt a terrible certainty, an overwhelming dread that filled her heart with ice. She was fading from the world, her existence slipping like sand through her fingers, and there was no one who could save her. The chapter ends with Violet staring into the mirror, her own reflection growing distant, her face a blurred outline that even she can barely recognize. Chapter 2. Flickering Memories. Violet woke up with an inexplicable sense of emptiness weighing on her chest. The room around her was bathed in soft morning light, but somehow everything felt wrong. Her bed, once a cozy cocoon, now felt cold and unfamiliar. Her favorite pillow, with its faint scent of lavender, had lost its warmth, as if she were lying in a stranger's room. Brushing it off as a bad night's sleep, she went about her usual routine, trying to convince herself that this creeping unease was just her imagination. When Violet went downstairs, she found her mother in the kitchen, moving about in her usual early morning routine. The sound of clinking coffee mugs, the faint aroma of toast, everything was exactly as it should have been, but somehow off. Her mother barely glanced at her, giving only the briefest acknowledgement before returning to her tasks. Violet hesitated, an inexplicable chill settling over her as she looked at her mother's face. There was a distant, almost puzzled look in her eyes, as though she were trying to remember something important, but couldn't quite grasp it. "Morning, Mum," Violet greeted, forcing a smile, waiting for a warm response. Her mother glanced at her briefly, nodded, but didn't respond. She turned back to the sink, her movements mechanical, distant. Shaking off the strange moment, Violet ate her breakfast in silence and left for school. As she walked, her mind buzzed with questions. Why had her mother looked at her like that? And why did everything seem to feel so unfamiliar today? She brushed it off, blaming it on stress and lack of sleep. When she arrived at school, things only got stranger. She spotted her best friend Sarah standing by her locker and waved as she approached. But Sarah's eyes passed over her, looking right through her. Violet stopped in her tracks, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. "Sarah, over here," she called out. Sarah turned, her face blank, almost confused, as if Violet was just another stranger in the crowded hallway. Violet's heart sank as she saw the lack of recognition in her friend's eyes. She walked up to Sarah, feeling a desperate urge to bridge this inexplicable distance. "Sarah, hey," she said, trying to sound casual. "Did you finish that history project? I spent all night on mine." Sarah frowned, her gaze clouded with confusion. Sorry, do I know you?" Violet's breath caught in her throat. She forced a laugh, trying to shake off the panic rising in her. "Very funny, Sarah." "It's me, Violet!" But Sarah just stared, her face devoid of any sign of recognition. Her friend's gaze shifted uncomfortably before she muttered, "I think you've got the wrong person." And with that she turned away, leaving Violet standing in the hallway feeling like she had just been struck by a wave of icy water. The rest of the school day passed in a fog. People who had once been her friends, people she had known for years, acted as if she were invisible. Teachers looked past her as they called roll, her name either skipped over or forgotten altogether. Violet's mind raced with questions she had no answers to. She couldn't help but feel as though she were slowly fading from existence, slipping away from the people she loved. When she got home that afternoon, the house felt quieter, emptier. Her mother barely glanced at her when she walked through the door, barely acknowledging her presence. Violet trudged up to her room, her heart heavy with confusion and fear. Desperate for some semblance of familiarity, she reached for the family photo album on her bookshelf. Flipping through the pages, she felt a chill spread through her as she noticed something horrifying. Her image, the vibrant young girl she knew herself to be, was no longer as she remembered. Where she should have been smiling next to her parents in the vacation photos or blowing out candles on her birthday cake, there was now only a faint blur, a shadowy outline where she once stood. Her face was obscured, her features softened into a faint ghostly impression. Violet's hands trembled as she closed the album, unable to bear the sight any longer. Panic clawed at her throat, and she tried to convince herself it was all just a trick of the light or some sort of printing error. But deep down, she knew that something terrible was happening. She was losing herself, slipping away from the world she had always known. Desperate for answers, Violet turned to the mirror, hoping to see her familiar reflection staring back at her. But what she saw only heightened her dread. Her image flickered in and out, like a fading photograph exposed to too much light. Her face looked distant, almost translucent, as if she were slowly fading from reality itself. She raised her hand to touch the cold glass, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the mirror. For a brief moment, her reflection seemed to solidify, her eyes wide with fear. But then, in the blink of an eye, her face blurred again, and she could barely recognize the person staring back at her. That night, Violet lay awake in bed, unable to shake the feeling of isolation that had crept into her life. It was as if the universe itself was erasing her, one memory at a time. She reached for her phone, desperate to capture her image, to prove that she still existed. She snapped a selfie, but when she looked at the screen, the photo was empty. There was no trace of her face, no sign that she had ever been there. She scribbled her thoughts in a journal, hoping that the words would anchor her to reality, but even the ink seemed to vanish from the pages. Each word she wrote faded, like water evaporating from a sun-drenched stone. With each attempt, the fear grew stronger, the sense of loss deeper. Violet lay in bed, clutching her journal, her hands trembling. She closed her eyes, letting the tears slide down her cheeks, and whispered into the darkness, "Please, someone remember me." The silence that answered was absolute, echoing through her mind, filling the emptiness that had taken over her life. In that moment, Violet understood the chilling truth. She was vanishing, piece by piece, memory by memory, and soon there would be nothing left. Chapter 3. Seeking Answers. Violet's isolation grew, a constant pressure, pressing down on her with each passing day. The faces around her became duller, their expressions blank whenever they looked her way, like actors unsure of their lines. Each time she spoke, her words seemed to drift into an empty, soundless void, like echoes swallowed by the darkness. It was as if the world was unraveling, thread by thread, stripping away her place in it. At first, she held out hope. Maybe there was an explanation, something she could fix. She reasoned that people didn't just disappear from existence without a cause, and so, her quest for answers began. She visited the school nurse, her eyes full of desperation as she tried to explain her situation, describing the strange sensations, the feeling of fading, and the eerie interactions with friends who seemed to forget her entirely. The nurse listened, nodding occasionally, but Violet saw the doubt lurking in her eyes. Perhaps it's stress, the nurse suggested, a kind but dismissive smile on her face. Sometimes schoolwork can take a toll, make us feel like we're losing touch. No, it's not like that, Violet insisted. It's different. My own family barely knows me anymore. Even my best friend Sarah looked at me like a stranger. But the nurse only nodded sympathetically. Why don't you take a few days to rest? It might do you some good. Violet left the office feeling defeated, the icy grip of fear tightening around her heart. Even in a room full of people, she felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That night, she turned to the internet, searching for any hint, any story that could explain what was happening to her. She read through forums, articles, and strange personal accounts of people who claimed they had also felt themselves disappearing. Tales of forgotten names, faded photos, even entire families that one day woke up and no longer recognized one another. But none offered any solutions, only stories of people vanishing into oblivion, swallowed by an unseen force beyond their understanding. For hours, she combed through page after page, the glow of the screen casting ghostly shadows across her face. She clung to every detail, every hint that could point to something, anything that might save her. But each account seemed to end the same way, with the person slipping from memory, from photographs, from life itself until nothing remained. It was as though they had never existed at all. Desperation pushed her to keep searching. In the silence of her room, Violet began calling out to anyone, anything that might hear her. "I don't want to disappear," she whispered, her voice raw and trembling. "Please, I just want to be seen." A chill washed over her, and she sensed that she was not alone. Shadows pooled in the corners of her room, darker and thicker than they should have been, like a living thing watching her. Violet felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was only her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something was there, lurking just beyond her vision. In the days that followed, her life continued to unravel. Teachers marked her as absent even when she was right in front of them. Friends passed by without a second glance, and even the house she called home felt like it was slipping away from her grasp. Her belongings vanished mysteriously, her favorite books, her clothes, even small trinkets she'd collected over the years, all fading, as though they had never been there. One night, Violet woke to the sensation of someone watching her. Her room was shrouded in darkness, yet she felt a presence. She strained her eyes, peering into the dim corners, and that's when she saw it. A figure, barely discernible, lurking in the shadows. It was faceless, a silhouette with no features, but it radiated an unnatural coldness that seemed to seep into her very bones. She stared, frozen in terror, feeling its gaze upon her even though it had no eyes. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice shaking. The figure remained silent, unmoving. She blinked, and in that instant, it vanished, leaving only an eerie silence and the lingering chill in the room. Heart pounding, she buried herself beneath the blankets, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She couldn't shake the feeling that the shadowy figure was somehow connected to her fading existence, a harbinger of the darkness that seemed to be swallowing her life. In her desperation, she tried to confide in her family again, hoping that someone, anyone, would believe her. She described the disappearing objects, the faded photos, and the shadowy figure. But her parents simply exchanged worried glances, their faces clouded with disbelief and concern. "Sweetheart," her mother said gently, reaching out to touch her arm. "We don't see anything unusual. Maybe you're just Stressed. Violet pulled back, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over her. I'm not making this up. It's real. Please, you have to believe me, she pleaded, her voice breaking. Her parents exchanged another glance, one that spoke of doubt and pity. Her father sighed. We'll get you some help, Violet. Just try to rest, okay? The frustration and fear were too much to bear. She stormed out of the room, feeling more alone than ever. The world around her was crumbling, slipping away like sand through her fingers, and no one could see it but her. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind drifted back to the figure in the shadows. She remembered the coldness that had filled the room, the silent, suffocating presence. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was real, and Violet felt certain that whatever that figure was, it had something to do with her fading from the world. It was as if it were feeding on her existence, drawing her into its dark, silent void. She could sense it now, lurking just out of sight, waiting patiently, as if it knew she was powerless to escape. With a new determination, she resolved to find a way to confront this thing, this force that was erasing her. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't let it win. Her very existence depended on it. Chapter 3. Seeking Answers. As days passed, Violet's sense of isolation deepened, like a thick fog settling over her life. The once familiar faces around her had grown hollow and distant, their expressions blank and unfocused whenever they looked in her direction. Every interaction seemed to unravel further. People who once called her name now hesitated, their words catching in their throats as if she were an apparition hovering just beyond their sight. Violet couldn't accept it. She had to believe there was a logical explanation, something she could understand, something she could fix. Desperation drove her to start her search. She visited the school nurse first, hoping she would be able to explain the strange symptoms that had begun to plague her daily life. When she sat down in the nurse's office, her voice trembled as she described the feeling of fading, the eerie sensation that people were forgetting her. The nurse listened quietly, her head tilted, her expression mild and polite, but Violet could see the faint flicker of doubt in her eyes. It sounds like you're experiencing some kind of dissociation, Violet, she said gently. Maybe the pressure of school is causing you to feel disconnected. It's common, especially for students your age. No, Violet insisted, her voice shaking with urgency. It's not just stress. My parents, my friends, even my own memories are slipping away from me. And there's something else. I keep seeing shadows. They're watching me. But the nurse's polite smile stayed in place, a veneer of professionalism shielding her from Violet's desperation. I think some time off would help, she suggested. Rest, and maybe talk to a counselor. Things might seem clearer after a break. The words felt like a dismissal, a polite way of pushing her out the door. Violet walked out of the office feeling more isolated than ever, the icy grip of fear winding tighter around her heart. Every step through the school hallways felt like walking through an alien world where no one knew her. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring into the darkness, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. The silence felt suffocating, and her fear felt so tangible, so real, that it seemed to thicken the very air around her. She reached for her laptop, a sudden frantic need driving her to seek out any explanation, any story that might shed light on her situation. She typed, "disappearing from reality, fading memories, forgotten by everyone," into the search bar, each phrase carrying her fear in stark digital letters. Hours passed, and Violet read through article after article, forum post after forum post, digging deeper into the endless labyrinth of the internet. Her eyes burned from the screen's glow, her heart pounding with each chilling tale she came across. She found scattered accounts from people who claimed they were disappearing, people who reported similar symptoms, the gradual erasure of their presence, the same eerie disconnections with their loved ones. One account, posted by an anonymous user, echoed her own experiences with haunting precision. "I feel like I'm slowly being erased from the world. Every day my family looks at me like a stranger. Friends forget who I am. Even photos of me are fading. It's like the universe is swallowing me piece by piece." Another entry described encounters with shadows in the dead of night, shadows that seemed to grow darker, colder, like living things feeding on the person's fading essence. As she read, Violet's hands began to tremble. She wanted to tell herself these were just stories, figments of other people's imaginations, but her own reality was unraveling in exactly the same way. The accounts she found offered no solutions, no hopeful endings, only a haunting silence, as though each person had simply disappeared. Panic crept into her veins, and she felt the weight of dread pressing down on her like a tidal wave. She tried to keep reading, but her mind recoiled, rejecting the possibility that her fate could be the same as those anonymous accounts. Her chest tightened, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She whispered into the darkness, "I'm still here. I'm still me. I don't want to disappear." Just then, she felt a chill creep over her skin, and the shadows in her room seemed to deepen, stretching from the corners like ink spreading across a page. She sat up, her eyes wide, peering into the darkness. There, at the edge of her vision, a figure stood, a faceless shadow that watched her in silence. It had no distinct features, no eyes or mouth, but she could feel its gaze, a cold and heavy weight that pressed into her soul. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear. The figure remained still, unmoving, its presence looming like a spectre of her worst fears. She blinked, and in that instant, it vanished, leaving only a hollow emptiness in the air. She sat frozen, her heart pounding, her skin cold with terror. Whatever this entity was, she knew it was no hallucination. It was real, and it had taken an interest in her. Deep down, she sensed that it was connected to her vanishing, to the strange unraveling of her life. The next morning, Violet's terror hadn't faded. Desperate to be understood, she tried to confide in her family, hoping against hope that they would finally believe her. She described the vanishing photographs, the fading memories, and the shadow that had appeared in her room. Her voice cracked as she pleaded with them to listen. But her parents exchanged uneasy glances, their faces etched with worry and disbelief. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Violet, sweetheart, we don't see any shadows. You're safe. I promise. Please," she whispered, her voice barely holding back the tears. "I'm not making this up. It's real. I'm disappearing and there's something in the shadows." Her father sighed, casting a look at her mother. "Maybe she's right," he murmured softly, not meeting Violet's eyes. "Maybe she needs help." They suggested she see a doctor, someone who could help her understand what was happening. Her frustration and fear turned to bitterness as she realized that even her own family was beginning to forget who she was. With a heavy heart, she retreated to her room, where the walls seemed to close in on her, pressing her into an ever-shrinking space of despair. Days turned into a blur of isolation and dread. People barely noticed her presence. Her friends no longer even looked her way, and her belongings continued to vanish. Small, familiar objects disappeared from her room, each one stolen away into some dark void she couldn't comprehend. She felt as though pieces of her life were being torn from her, leaving behind empty spaces, echoes of what had once been. One evening, as the sky darkened, Violet sat on her bed, clutching her journal, a thin thread of her identity. She opened it, hoping that her words could keep her anchored to reality. She wrote down her fears, her confusion, every detail she could remember about her life, desperate to hold on to any sense of herself. But as she wrote, the ink seemed to bleed into the paper, growing fainter, as if it were being erased as she watched. In a panic, she pressed harder, scribbling her name over and over. "Violet. Violet." But the words faded, disappearing before her eyes, leaving only blank pages behind. That night, she lay in the dark, her thoughts racing, fear twisting inside her. She could sense the shadowy figure again, lurking just beyond her sight, waiting with silent patience. It felt as if it were part of the darkness itself, woven into the very fabric of her fading world. The shadows stretched out toward her, cold tendrils reaching for her, a presence that promised oblivion. Violet's breath came in shallow gasps as she whispered, "Please, don't let me disappear. I just want someone to see me, to remember me." But only silence answered, an empty, hollow sound, that swallowed her words whole. In that moment, she knew that the shadow wasn't merely an apparition. It was an entity, a force that existed to erase, to consume, and it had chosen her. Chapter 4. The Unseen Figure. As the days slipped by, Violet's world grew darker. She felt her existence dwindling with each sunrise, slipping through the cracks of reality like sand through an hourglass. Every morning she woke with the eerie sense that more of herself had vanished, that some part of her had been peeled away and left behind in a shadowy void. Her skin felt cold to the touch, her pulse faint, and her voice, whenever she dared to speak, seemed thin, fragile, as if the air itself absorbed her words before they reached anyone else's ears. It was on one of these dim mornings, while preparing for school, that Violet first sensed the full weight of a presence in her room. She'd been brushing her hair, staring into the mirror when her reflection seemed to dim, her face becoming hazy and indistinct. In the fogged reflection, she caught a faint movement at the edge of her vision, a shadow in the corner, coalescing, thickening, like ink swirling in water. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat, but nothing was there. The room was empty, silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves outside her window. Heart pounding, she tried to shake off the sensation, chalking it up to paranoia. But the feeling lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on her. At school, her isolation intensified. Students moved around her like wraiths, their laughter and voices distant echoes in her ears. Sarah passed her in the hallway without a second glance. Her teachers looked through her as if she were a transparent ghost haunting the halls. Every step felt like walking through a different world, a shadow world, where she alone could sense the terror creeping just beyond the surface. One evening, driven to the edge of despair, Violet tried to speak with her parents again. They sat in the living room, quietly reading, the soft glow of the lamps casting a warm light across their faces. But even that warmth felt out of reach, as though she were standing outside a house, peering through a frosted window into a world she could never touch again. "Mom? Dad?" she called, her voice barely rising above a whisper. They looked up, their faces blank, eyes empty. I need to talk to you. Please, something's happening to me," Violet pleaded, her hands shaking as she tried to explain the terrifying shadow that seemed to be following her, the feeling that she was slipping away from reality itself. Her parents exchanged a glance, that same wary, doubtful look she had seen too many times. Her mother's mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but then she stopped, her gaze shifting. She looked past Violet, her expression unreadable, distant, as if she were trying to remember something long forgotten. Violet's father cleared his throat. "Sweetheart," he said softly, his voice tinged with a strange kind of pity. Maybe you just need rest. You've been stressed with school, and, well, we can't see anything wrong." The words landed like a final nail in a coffin, sealing Violet into a world where no one could hear her, where no one believed her. She stood, turning away from them, her heart pounding with frustration, grief, and anger. As she trudged back up the stairs to her room, she felt that invisible presence again, like eyes watching her from the shadows, a constant, oppressive weight pressing down on her, making her limbs feel heavy and her breath shallow. That night, unable to sleep, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down like a suffocating shroud. It was then that she felt it again. The presence. This time, it was unmistakable. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural chill that made her shiver. She turned her head slowly, her eyes wide, straining to see in the dim light. And there, in the far corner of her room, she saw it. A figure, dark and shapeless, stood watching her. It was like a living shadow, its edges blurring into the darkness around it, as if it were made of the very fabric of night. She couldn't make out any features, no eyes, no mouth, just an outline of something tall, unmoving and intensely aware of her. Violet tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, leaving only a strangled gasp. Her body felt paralyzed, her limbs heavy and unresponsive, as if the very presence of the figure had drained her of strength. She forced herself to blink, her heart racing, and for a split second, she thought she saw the faintest glint of eyes, a cold, piercing stare that cut through the darkness. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It stood there, silent, as if waiting. She could feel its gaze, a weight pressing down on her, filling her with a terror so deep it was like ice in her veins. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her chest tight with fear. For what felt like an eternity, the figure remained still, unmoving, its silent gaze locked onto her. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it faded into the shadows, melting back into the darkness, leaving only the faintest trace of cold in the room. When it was finally gone, Violet sat up, gasping, her body drenched in sweat. She felt as though she had narrowly escaped something far worse than death, something that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to claim her. In the following days, Violet's desperation grew. The figure didn't return, but its presence lingered, a constant shadow in the corners of her vision. She began seeing it in reflections, glimpses in mirrors, in darkened windows, always watching, always waiting. She became paranoid, glancing over her shoulder, expecting it to appear at any moment. The slightest flicker of shadow would send her heart racing, her mind spiraling with terror. Determined to confront whatever was haunting her, she began to search for any clue that might explain what the shadow was, what it wanted, and why it had chosen her. She combed through libraries, scanned online forums, seeking out stories, folklore, anything that could provide her with a hint of understanding. But no matter how many pages she turned, how many words she read, she found nothing that could explain the entity that haunted her. One night, driven by desperation, she lit a candle and sat before her mirror, staring into her own eyes, willing herself to confront the shadow. She had read stories of people summoning spirits through mirrors, of calling forth the darkness to reveal itself. Her reflection stared back, pale and terrified, but she held her ground, her gaze unflinching. "I know you're there," she whispered into the silence, her voice shaking. "Show yourself." For a long moment nothing happened. The candle flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls, her own reflection warped by the dancing flame. But then, slowly, she saw something. Her reflection grew dim, her face blurring, and in its place, the shadow appeared, as if it had replaced her entirely. She recoiled, the chair scraping against the floor as she stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The figure in the mirror stared back at her, its form dark and featureless, but its presence overwhelming. Violet could feel it pulling at her, as if trying to draw her into the mirror, to pull her into the void it inhabited. "No!" she gasped, backing away, her hands trembling. The shadow didn't move, but its presence filled the room, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could feel herself growing weaker, her vision dimming, as if the very essence of her being were being drawn into the figure, consumed by its darkness. With a final burst of strength, she reached out, knocking the candle to the floor. It sputtered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The shadow vanished, leaving her alone, trembling, the echoes of its presence lingering in the cold air. That night, Violet lay in bed, exhausted and terrified, clutching her pillow as if it were a lifeline. She realized with chilling certainty that the shadow was no ordinary ghost or figment of her imagination. It was something far more ancient, far more malevolent, a creature that existed to consume, to erase, and it had chosen her. In the quiet darkness, Violet made a vow. She wouldn't let the shadow win. No matter how close it came, no matter how many pieces of her it took, she would fight. She would hold on to her memories, her identity, her very soul. But deep down, she knew that the battle had only just begun, and the shadow, patient and unyielding, was waiting. Chapter 5. A Fragmented Existence. As days turned to weeks, Violet's life grew colder, quieter, and more desolate. Her existence had become fractured, slipping away piece by piece, leaving her an unsteady shadow wandering through a world that no longer recognized her. She clung to each moment, to each fragment of herself, but they seemed to dissolve like mist in the sunlight, as though her very essence were being drawn into a void. The people around her, even her own family, continued to drift farther away. Her parents still shared the same house, still sat around the same dinner table, but their faces were mere echoes of familiarity. They looked at her with expressions of polite detachment, as if she were a distant acquaintance. Each glance in her direction felt empty, hollow, and Violet felt like a stranger in her own home, drifting further from the life she had once known. One night, she gathered what little courage she had left and went into the living room where her mother was watching an old family video. Her heart leapt when she saw the flickering images of her childhood on the screen. A picnic at the lake, laughter filling the air, her mother's joyful voice as she called Violet's name. But then Violet noticed something that made her stomach twist with dread. In the video, her mother was laughing and smiling, but she wasn't looking at anyone. Where Violet should have been in the frame, there was nothing. Only an empty space where she had once stood, as though she had never been there at all. Her mother's smile was directed at a blank spot, a gap that felt more ominous than any shadow she had ever seen. "Mom," Violet whispered, her voice tight with fear. Do you remember that day?" Her mother's gaze shifted, her smile fading as she looked up at Violet with blank, unseeing eyes. "Of course, dear. It was a wonderful day," she replied, her tone distant, hollow. There was no recognition, no spark of connection, as if the person on the screen, the child her mother once loved, had ceased to exist. Violet's voice trembled. "But, do you remember me being there?" Her mother's eyes drifted away, her smile vacant. I remember it was a beautiful day." And with that, she turned back to the screen, her face empty of any emotion. The realization settled over Violet like a shroud. She had been erased from her mother's memories, erased from the very fabric of her past. She stumbled back to her room, feeling as if the walls were closing in on her, suffocating her with their silence. Her world had become a series of ghostly echoes, shadows of memories she could no longer claim as her own. Desperate to hold on to any fragment of her existence, Violet began collecting objects that reminded her of who she was. An old teddy bear, a diary from middle school, a broken bracelet Sarah had once given her. She lined them up on her dresser, each item a silent witness to the life she was slowly losing. But every morning, more items would vanish, as if plucked away by an invisible hand. Her possessions, her memories, her identity, all of it was slipping through her fingers. And always, lurking in the corners of her vision, was the shadow. It appeared at night, when the house was dark and silent, waiting patiently in the corners of her room. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of it in the mirror, a dark figure standing just behind her, its presence cold and suffocating. She felt its gaze on her, an unyielding weight that seemed to sap the strength from her body, drawing her closer to the edge of oblivion. One night, as she lay in bed, exhausted and haunted, she felt the familiar chill creeping over her. The shadows seemed to deepen, thickening like a gathering storm. She could feel it watching her, the air heavy with a darkness that pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. Summoning what little courage she had left, Violet sat up, her gaze fixed on the corner of the room. "Why are you doing this to me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond, but it shifted slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. She could feel it, a dark, formless entity that seemed to pulse with a hunger that went beyond words. It felt ancient, as though it had existed for centuries, feeding on lives, memories, and the essence of those it chose. In that moment, she understood. The shadow wasn't merely a figment of her imagination. It was a force, a creature that thrived on erasure. It had marked her, chosen her to be erased from the world, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. The realization filled her with a cold, unrelenting terror, but also a strange resolve. She wouldn't let it consume her, wouldn't let it take away everything she had once been. She would fight, even if it meant confronting the very darkness that sought to destroy her. Over the next few days, Violet began to resist in small ways. She whispered her own name under her breath, repeating it over and over, as though the sound could anchor her to reality. She recited memories, small details that made up who she was, her favorite color, her dreams, the people she loved. She etched these fragments into her mind, refusing to let them fade. But the shadow grew stronger, its presence more oppressive. She felt it everywhere, in the shadows that filled her room at night, in the coldness that clung to her skin, in the silence that seemed to echo with her own fading voice. It was as if the darkness itself was wrapping around her, pulling her closer with every passing moment. One evening, while searching for any remaining keepsakes of her life, Violet stumbled upon a photo she hadn't seen before, tucked away at the back of a drawer. It was a picture of her and Sarah, taken years ago, laughing and carefree. But in the photo, her own image had begun to blur, her face a faint smudge, her features unrecognizable. She stared at it, a hollow ache settling in her chest. Even her memories, the pieces she had clung to so fiercely, were slipping away. And then, as she stared at the photo, she saw it, the shadow. It was there, faint and almost invisible, but unmistakably present, looming just behind her in the photograph. She gasped, dropping the photo, her heart pounding with terror. The shadow had been with her all along, a silent presence, a dark thread woven into the fabric of her life, waiting for the right moment to consume her completely. Desperation surged within her, a fierce, unyielding need to survive. She couldn't let it end like this. She wouldn't let it win. Driven by a newfound determination, Violet gathered her remaining keepsakes, clutching them tightly, as if their presence could keep her anchored. She began speaking to them, whispering her memories, her dreams, her very identity, pouring every fragment of herself into those objects, hoping that somehow they could hold the pieces of her soul. And then she did something she hadn't dared to do before. She stepped into the darkness, into the very heart of the shadows that filled her room, confronting the entity that had haunted her every moment. "I won't let you take me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I am Violet. I exist, and you will not erase me." For a moment, the shadows seemed to hesitate, as if acknowledging her defiance. But then they surged forward, a wave of darkness that engulfed her, filling her vision with a blackness so absolute that it felt like drowning. She struggled, fighting against the suffocating weight, her mind racing with memories, fragments of her life, each one slipping away as the darkness closed in. But even as the shadows tightened around her, she held on to one thought, one memory, one spark of light in the overwhelming void. She was Violet, and she would not vanish without a fight. The darkness retreated slightly, as if repelled by her determination. But she knew this was only the beginning. The shadow was patient, relentless, and it would not rest until she was nothing more than a faded memory, an echo lost in time. As she lay there, surrounded by darkness, Violet made a silent vow. She would find a way to survive. She would find a way to outlast the shadow, to reclaim her place in the world. No matter how long it took, no matter how many pieces of herself she lost, she would keep fighting. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, the entity watched, waiting. Chapter 6. An unlikely ally. The days grew colder, and Violet's world felt like it was contracting around her, collapsing under the weight of a force she couldn't name. The shadow had become her constant companion, an entity lurking in every corner, watching, waiting. It felt as if it was part of her now, a dark presence entwined with her life, its reach extending further with each passing day. Violet no longer felt like a part of the world she had once known. Instead, she felt like a ghost, drifting through familiar spaces that now held no warmth, no safety. One afternoon, exhausted and desperate, she wandered the empty hallways of her school, her thoughts heavy with fear. Her footsteps echoed, each sound a reminder that no one was listening. No one was there. As she turned a corner, she stumbled, nearly colliding with someone. She looked up, her heart pounding, and saw a boy she didn't recognize standing before her. He was tall, with dark hair that fell over his eyes, and his expression was one of deep, quiet sorrow. She was about to apologize when she noticed something strange. His eyes were fixed on her, focused, seeing her fully. He didn't look away, didn't glance past her like everyone else. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, in a way that no one else had in weeks. You're real," Violet whispered, her voice choked with a mix of hope and disbelief. The boy nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. You see me too? He asked, his voice soft, cautious. Violet's heart raced as she nodded. Yes, I see you. I thought I was disappearing. So did I, he replied, his expression darkening. I'm Evan. They stood there, both silent, letting the weight of their shared realization settle over them. In that moment, Violet felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in days. She wasn't alone. Someone else understood. Someone else had seen the darkness creeping into her life. Evan led her to an empty classroom, his steps quiet, his presence a calm certainty that steadied her nerves. Once inside, he turned to her, his face a mixture of determination and sorrow. I've been disappearing too, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was going crazy. People stopped noticing me. My things started to vanish, and I've been haunted by something. Violet shivered, the memory of the shadow flooding her mind. A shadow, she murmured, her voice trembling. You've seen it too? Evan's eyes widened and he nodded. Yes. It follows me, always lurking just out of sight. It's as if it's feeding on me, taking pieces of my life, my memories. Violet felt a surge of relief and fear mingling within her. They shared the same curse, the same horror, and suddenly she understood that whatever was haunting her wasn't just after her. It was something larger, something that affected others as well. Do you know what it is? She asked, her voice filled with desperate hope. Evan hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window as he spoke. I've done some research, tried to find answers. All I found were fragments, stories of people who faded away, people who were forgotten by everyone. They called them the shadowed ones, people chosen to vanish from reality, to be erased from existence. Violet's hands shook as she absorbed his words. The shadowed ones. It felt ominous, chilling, a name steeped in despair. She thought of all the moments she'd been overlooked, all the memories that had slipped away, and the shadow that had haunted her every step. Why us? She whispered, more to herself than to Evan. Why are we being erased? Evan shook his head. I don't know, but I think it's because of the shadow. It's like it's devouring us, feeding on our memories, erasing everything that makes us who we are. They sat in silence, the weight of their shared burden filling the room. Violet's mind raced, searching for something, anything that could save her, save them both. If the shadow was feeding on their lives, on their memories, then perhaps there was a way to resist, to fight back. Have you tried holding on to things? She asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. I mean, anything that keeps you connected to who you are. Evan nodded slowly. I've tried. I kept a journal, wrote down everything I could remember, but the words faded. Pictures disappeared. It's as if the shadow knows, as if it's actively trying to erase any trace of us. Violet clenched her fists, a surge of anger igniting within her. She was done feeling helpless, done watching as her life was stolen from her. Then we'll have to be smarter, she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. If it's trying to erase us, we need to find a way to keep our memories safe, to anchor ourselves. Evan looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. How? Violet's mind raced, piecing together an idea. Maybe if we keep physical reminders, hidden ones that the shadow can't find, things that are meaningful, that connect us to our lives, we can hide them somewhere, create a place that the shadow doesn't know about. Evan nodded, the determination in his eyes mirroring her own. We can do it together. We'll gather whatever we can, hide it where it can't reach, and keep each other grounded. Over the next few days, Violet and Evan worked in secret, gathering trinkets, photographs, letters, anything that held meaning, anything that might preserve a fragment of themselves. They hid them in places they thought the shadow wouldn't reach, each item a silent rebellion against the darkness that sought to consume them. In each other's presence they felt stronger, less vulnerable to the shadow's pull. They spent hours sharing memories, telling each other stories from their lives, creating bonds that felt unbreakable, connections the shadow couldn't sever. They became each other's anchors, their friendship a lifeline in the dark, a reminder that they still existed, that they were still real. But as the days passed, they noticed the shadow growing bolder. It appeared more frequently, its presence darker, colder. Violet could feel it in every corner, every shadow cast by the fading sunlight. It was no longer satisfied with lurking in the background. It was hungry, desperate, and Violet sensed that it was aware of their resistance, of the defiance that burned within them. One night, as she lay in bed, Violet felt the shadow's presence pressing in on her, suffocating, an overwhelming darkness that filled her room. She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing on the memories she had shared with Evan, the strength they had built together. She clung to those moments, the laughter, the stories, the bond they had forged, hoping it would be enough to keep the darkness at bay. But the shadow was relentless. It surged forward, consuming every inch of light, every spark of warmth, filling her with a cold, crushing emptiness. She felt her memories slipping, fading, as if the very essence of her life were being drained away. In that moment of despair, Violet's thoughts turned to Evan. She pictured his face, his quiet strength, the way he had looked at her with understanding, with recognition. She focused on that memory, on the friendship they had created, and a surge of determination filled her, a fierce defiance that pushed back against the darkness. The shadow recoiled, its hold weakening, as if it were repelled by her resolve. Violet felt the coldness lift, the darkness receding, leaving her alone in the quiet stillness of her room. The next day, she met Evan in their usual hiding spot, her face pale, her body weak, but her spirit unbroken. They exchanged a look of understanding, of silent determination. "We have to find a way to end this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The shadow is growing stronger. If we don't stop it..." Evan nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll find a way. Together." And in that moment, Violet knew that their bond was more than just a friendship. It was their salvation, their shield against the darkness that sought to consume them. Together, they would fight, even if it meant facing the shadow head-on, even if it meant confronting the very heart of the darkness that haunted them. Because as long as they had each other, as long as they held on to the memories that defined them, they would remain, seen, remembered, unbroken. But deep within the shadows, the entity waited, watching, patient and unyielding, its hunger growing with every passing moment. It knew their resistance, sensed their defiance, and it would not rest until every trace of them was erased from existence. Chapter 7. The Curse of the Shadowed Ones. Violet and Evan's connection gave them a fragile hope, a sense of purpose in the face of the relentless shadow. Yet, even as they clung to each other, Violet could feel the shadow's presence growing stronger, more insistent, slipping into every corner of their lives. It had become a constant weight, pressing down on her like an invisible hand, tightening its grip with every passing day. One evening, desperate for answers, Violet and Evan met in the hidden alcove at the back of the library, a place they had claimed as their refuge from the darkness that pursued them. The shadows were thick here, but they felt safe in each other's company, as though their shared determination could keep the darkness at bay. "I've been thinking," Evan said, breaking the silence, his voice low, "about the stories I found, about the shadowed ones." Violet's heart quickened at the mention. The shadowed ones. The term had lingered in her mind since Evan first told her about it, filling her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. Do you think that's what we are? Part of some cursed group?" Evan's gaze was distant, troubled. "Maybe. The more I read, the more it all starts to make sense. The shadow isn't just some entity that haunts us. It's a part of something larger, a force that selects people, marking them for erasure." He pulled a notebook from his bag, flipping through pages of scribbled notes and fragments of research. "I found an old article about a man who claimed to be one of the shadowed ones. He said he'd been cursed, that the universe itself had chosen him to be forgotten, erased from existence." Violet shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as she absorbed Evan's words. "But why us? What did we do to deserve this?" Evan shook his head, his expression pained. I don't think it's about what we did. It's like the universe randomly picks people, pulling them into this void. Maybe it's testing us, seeing how far we'll go to hold on to our existence. Violet's mind spun with questions, doubts, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She felt like a pawn in some cosmic game, a piece on a board she couldn't see or understand. But there has to be a way to fight it, she whispered. There has to be something we can do to break this curse. Evan met her gaze, his eyes filled with the same determination she felt burning within her. I think it has to do with memories. The shadow thrives on erasing our connections, breaking down our identities piece by piece. But if we hold on to the memories, if we anchor ourselves in who we are, maybe we can weaken its hold. The thought gave Violet a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness that had consumed her life. She clenched her fists, determination filling her. Then we'll start preserving everything, every detail, every memory. We'll find a way to make it real, so real that the shadow can't erase it. For the next several days, Violet and Evan threw themselves into their plan with fervor, working tirelessly to record every memory, every piece of themselves that they could hold on to. They wrote down stories from their childhood, described their families, their dreams, their favorite moments. They even began creating a secret cache of keepsakes, small objects that reminded them of who they were. They hid these keepsakes in secret spots around the school and in the town, places only they would know. Yet, even as they fought to preserve themselves, the shadow's presence intensified. It began appearing more frequently, closer, and with a malevolence that filled Violet with dread. She could feel it watching her, lurking in the corners of her room, in the darkened hallways of her school. She began having strange dreams, vivid and haunting, of endless hallways filled with shadows, of voices whispering her name, taunting her as she drifted into a void. One night, while she and Evan were hiding keepsakes behind an old bookshelf in the library, Violet felt a chill run down her spine. She turned, her breath catching as she saw the shadow, darker and more menacing than ever, standing at the edge of the room. It was as if it were waiting, watching their every move, its presence like a black hole pulling them in. It knows, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Evan turned, his face paling as he saw the shadow. It's not just watching us. It's aware of what we're doing. It's trying to stop us. They backed away, their hearts pounding, but the shadow didn't follow. It simply stood there, its dark form shifting slightly, as if mocking them, reminding them of the inevitable. The next day, Evan came to Violet with a look of determination. We have to face it, he said, his voice steady. We can't keep running. If we're going to survive this, we need to confront it, head on. Violet's heart pounded at the thought, fear tightening her chest. How? How can we confront something that's not even human? Evan took her hand, his grip firm. We have to show it that we're stronger than it thinks, that it can't erase us so easily. That night they returned to the library, their steps quiet as they moved through the darkened halls. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural coldness, and Violet could feel the shadow's presence more strongly than ever. She knew it was there, lurking, waiting for them. Together, they entered the small room where they had hidden their keepsakes, their sanctuary against the darkness. But the moment they stepped inside, the shadow was there, looming, its form towering over them, more menacing than ever. It pulsed with a dark energy, a hunger that seemed to reach out, pressing down on them, suffocating. Violet felt her knees weaken, but she held her ground, clinging to Evan's hand as she stared into the void that was the shadow. She forced herself to remember everything, her family, her dreams, the laughter she had shared with her friends, every piece of herself that defined her. She spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, each word a defiance. I am Violet. I am real. You can't erase me. Evan's voice joined hers, steady and unwavering. I am Evan. You can't take us away. The shadow recoiled, its form shifting, as though their words were pushing it back. But it was strong, relentless, a force that had fed on countless lives, countless memories. It surged forward, a wave of darkness crashing over them, filling their vision with an all-consuming blackness. Violet felt herself slipping, her memories blurring, her identity fading as the shadow's hold tightened around her. She clung to Evan, his presence grounding her, anchoring her to the world she was so desperately trying to hold on to. In that moment of despair, something flickered in the darkness. A light, faint but steady, piercing through the shadow's hold. It was their memories, their shared determination, a bond that the shadow couldn't break. The shadow hesitated, its form flickering, weakening in the face of their defiance. And in that brief moment, Violet felt a surge of strength, a fierce resolve that filled her with a power she hadn't known she possessed. With a final cry, she pushed back against the darkness, her voice filled with all the memories, all the pieces of herself that she refused to let go of. "You will not take us. We are real." The shadow let out a silent scream, a ripple of darkness that shook the room, and then it vanished, retreating into the corners, leaving them standing alone in the silence. Violet collapsed, her body trembling, but a fierce hope ignited within her. She had fought back, defied the darkness, and survived. For the first time, she felt a sliver of victory, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could win this battle. Evan helped her to her feet, his eyes filled with the same hope, the same determination. They weren't free yet. The shadow was still out there, waiting, watching. But they had proven that they could fight, that they could resist. And together, they would continue to fight, pushing back against the darkness, holding onto the fragments of their lives with all the strength they had. But deep in the shadows, the entity lingered, biding its time, knowing that the final battle was yet to come. Chapter 8. A fading hope. Days slipped by in a haunted blur, and Violet could feel herself diminishing. She was still present in the world, still walking through the halls of her school and the rooms of her home, but she felt like a shadow of her former self, like a faint echo drifting further away from reality with each passing moment. Her mind was fractured, her memories clouded, and her sense of self, fragile and splintered, was slipping through her fingers. The shadow was everywhere. Its presence was no longer confined to darkened rooms or fleeting moments. It lurked in every corner, filled every empty space. Even daylight, once her refuge, had grown dim and cold. No matter where she went, she felt its eyes on her, a weight pressing down on her chest, a darkness that crept into her thoughts and coloured her every emotion. Evan, her last anchor in the world, had grown distant too. He was there beside her, but something in him had faded, a hollowness that mirrored her own. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he spoke with a cautious, haunted tone. He, too, was losing the fight, slipping deeper into the shadow's grasp. One night, as Violet lay in her bed, a profound sense of dread settled over her. The room was silent, but the air felt thick, heavy, as if it were pressing in on her from all sides. The shadows on the walls seemed to pulse, a dark rhythm that matched the rapid pounding of her heart. She tried to ignore it, closing her eyes, forcing herself to breathe, to calm the fear that was clawing at her mind. But the silence was broken by a soft, whispering voice, a chilling murmur that seeped into her thoughts like poison. "You are mine, Violet," the voice breathed, each word a tendril of darkness that wrapped around her mind. "There is no escape. You cannot hide. You are slipping away, and soon. You will be nothing." The words filled her mind, pushing out every other thought, every fragment of hope, leaving only a hollow emptiness. She could feel the truth in those words, a cold inevitability that made her blood run cold. The shadow wasn't just haunting her, it was devouring her, piece by piece, consuming her memories, her identity, her very soul. Desperation surged within her, a last feeble attempt to cling to herself, to hold on to the fragments of who she was. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember, to summon every detail she could. Her mother's laugh, her father's comforting voice, the warmth of the sun on her face, the laughter she had shared with friends. But the memories were slippery, blurred, like images in a dream that faded as soon as she reached for them. "Please, don't take this from me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the shadow only laughed, a sound that was more felt than heard, a dark, twisted echo that filled the room, drowning out her voice. She felt its presence wrap around her, suffocating, relentless, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, she was no longer in her room. She was standing in a vast, endless expanse of darkness, an empty void where time and space had no meaning. Shadows stretched in every direction, moving, shifting, like a living entity that pulsed with a dark, unholy energy. And in the heart of that darkness, she saw it. A figure, a shape that was both formless and solid, shifting between shadows and substance, watching her with a cold, malevolent hunger. The shadow's form was a nightmare made real, a creature of pure darkness that seemed to breathe, its presence seeping into her skin, her bones, her very soul. She wanted to scream, to turn away, but she was frozen, paralyzed by its gaze. It reached out, a tendril of darkness stretching toward her, brushing against her skin with a cold that burned. "You cannot resist me," it whispered, its voice filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "You are nothing, a shadow, a fragment, and soon you will be gone." Violet felt herself slipping, her identity unraveling, her mind splintering into 1,000 pieces. She was losing herself, fading into the void, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But even in that darkness, a spark remained. A memory, faint and fragile, flickered in her mind. Evan. She remembered his face, his voice, his presence beside her. The bond they had forged, the strength they had drawn from each other. She clung to that memory, to the connection they shared, using it as an anchor, a lifeline that kept her from falling completely into the void. "No," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I am still here." The shadow recoiled, its form shifting, flickering as though it were weakening. She could feel its anger, its frustration, a dark, seething rage that filled the void, pressing down on her with a suffocating force. But she held on, clinging to that spark, refusing to let go. She thought of Evan, of her family, of every memory that defined her, every piece of herself that she refused to lose. Each memory was a light in the darkness, a fragile flame that kept the shadow at bay. The darkness trembled, the shadow's form flickering, wavering as though it were struggling to maintain its hold. And for a moment, Violet felt a surge of hope, a faint glimmer that maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. But the shadow was relentless. It surged forward, a wave of darkness crashing over her, filling her mind, her soul, consuming every thought, every memory, every piece of herself. She could feel herself fading, slipping away, her consciousness dissolving into the void. In a final, desperate act, she called out to Evan, her voice a silent plea, a cry that echoed through the darkness, reaching out for him, for anyone who could hear her. And then, through the suffocating darkness, she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. "Violet!" The sound pierced through the shadows, a beacon of light that cut through the darkness, pulling her back, grounding her in reality. She felt herself being lifted, drawn out of the void, the shadow's hold weakening as the voice grew louder, stronger. She opened her eyes, blinking against the darkness, and saw him, Evan, standing before her, his face filled with a fierce determination, his eyes blazing with a strength she had never seen before. "Violet, you're not alone," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "We're in this together. We can fight it." His words filled her with a warmth, a strength that pushed back against the darkness, filling her with a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. She reached out, her hand finding his, and in that moment, she knew that they could resist, that they could defy the shadow. The darkness trembled, the shadow recoiling, its form flickering as though it were weakening. It let out a silent scream, a sound that reverberated through the void, a dark, twisted rage that filled the air. But Violet and Evan stood together, their hands clasped, their bond a shield that protected them from the shadow's grasp. They were more than just fragments, more than shadows. They were real, and they would not be erased. Together they stepped forward, pushing back against the darkness, their presence a defiance, a light in the overwhelming void. The shadow recoiled, retreating, its form dissolving, weakening as they advanced, their voices a chorus of strength, a reminder that they would not be defeated. And in that moment, Violet knew that they had won. The shadow was defeated, its power broken, its hold on them shattered. As the darkness faded, the void dissolving into light, Violet felt a sense of peace, a warmth that filled her with a newfound strength. She had faced the darkness, fought against the void, and emerged victorious. And as she looked at Evan, her heart filled with gratitude, with hope. She knew that she was no longer alone. Together, they had conquered the shadow, defied the darkness, and reclaimed their place in the world. But as they stood there, surrounded by light, a chill ran down her spine. A reminder that the shadow was not gone, that it was still lurking, waiting, biding its time. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. And as long as the shadow remained, they would need each other. A bond forged in darkness, a strength born from the void. And with that knowledge, Violet took Evan's hand, her resolve unbroken, her spirit unyielding, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Together they would fight, they would resist, and they would not be forgotten. Chapter 9. The Final Stand. The days that followed their brief victory against the shadow were filled with a heavy silence, a silence that was worse than the most deafening scream. It wasn't the kind of peace that calms the soul. No, this was the eerie calm before the storm. The kind of quiet where something dark stirs, waiting to break free, to rip through the stillness with all the force of a nightmare. Violet could feel it. The shadow had retreated for the moment, but it wasn't gone. It had merely bided its time, gathering strength in the corners of her mind, lurking in the forgotten spaces between waking and sleeping. Every time Violet closed her eyes, she felt its cold breath on the back of her neck, the suffocating weight of its presence filling her thoughts, taunting her, whispering that it was coming for her again. The weight of the shadow's watchful eyes had begun to wear on her. Every night, it grew harder to sleep. The shadows in her room stretched unnaturally long, and the darkness seemed to swallow her whole, as if it were a part of her now, as if she were part of it. Sometimes, she could hear the shadow's whispers in the quiet of her room, too faint to understand but heavy with menace. And each whisper seemed to weaken her resolve, the ever-encroaching feeling that she was no longer the same person she had been before the darkness had come into her life and began to tear her apart piece by piece. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep running from it. The shadow was a part of her, a manifestation of her deepest fears and insecurities. And no matter how much she fought it, it would always return, stronger, angrier, more desperate to consume her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold, Violet met Evan at their usual spot, a quiet corner at the back of the library. They hadn't seen much of each other lately, both of them retreating into their own worlds of fear and isolation. It had become harder to be around each other, the bond between them feeling strained, stretched thin by the weight of what they were enduring. But tonight there was something different in Evan's eyes. His usually distant gaze was filled with determination, a glimmer of hope, or was it desperation? He approached her with a purposeful stride, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I think I've found a way to end this," he said, his voice low, but there was an undeniable force behind it. Violet looked at him, unsure if she was ready to hear what he had to say. "What do you mean?" "I found something," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "I've been researching the shadow, trying to understand it. It's not just an entity, it's part of a curse that was put in place long before either of us were born." Violet's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a cold chill run down her spine. "A curse?" Evan nodded grimly. "Yes. The shadow doesn't just feed on memories and identities. It's part of something bigger, a ritual, an ancient force. People who are marked by the shadow aren't just erased. They're forgotten by the entire world. Everything they are, everything they've done, everything they've ever loved, gone. And the curse, it doesn't end until there's nothing left." Violet's mind reeled. She had felt like a victim in this fight, as if the shadow had chosen her, as if it were merely a dark, malevolent force set out to erase her existence. But now, the truth felt even worse than the horror she had been living through. It wasn't just about her. It was about something ancient, something preordained, something that had been set in motion long before she had ever known the shadow existed. She could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on her chest, the realization that this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a battle for her very soul. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice shaky with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Evan's gaze hardened, determination flashing in his eyes. "We have to face the shadow head-on. We can't keep running from it. We need to find the source of the curse, the place where it began, and destroy it. If we do that, we can break the cycle. We can stop the shadow from taking us, from taking everything." Violet stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was immediately smothered by doubt. "And what if we fail?" she whispered. "What if there's nothing left to save?" Evan didn't answer immediately, and the silence between them felt like a suffocating weight. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Then we will fight until there's nothing left of us but the fight itself," he said. "We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the people we used to be." That night, Violet couldn't sleep. The shadows in her room pressed closer, seemed to grow thicker. She could hear the whispers again, faint but insistent, like the rustling of dry leaves caught in the wind. It was the shadow, mocking her, telling her that no matter what she did, it would win in the end. She could feel it now, more than ever. The shadow wasn't just an external force. It was inside her, feeding on her self-doubt, on her fear of losing herself. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to stay whole, to keep her identity intact. As she lay in bed, staring into the darkness, she realized something important. The shadow could take everything it wanted, her memories, her sense of self, even her body. But there was one thing it could never take from her: the will to fight. The next day, Violet and Evan set out, determined to face the shadow at its source. They followed the clues Evan had found, each one leading them deeper into the forgotten parts of the town, places that had long since been abandoned, places steeped in darkness. They reached an old church on the outskirts of town, its stone walls covered in creeping vines, its once beautiful stained glass windows shattered, leaving gaping holes in the walls. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the silence was oppressive, as though the building itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for them to arrive. The church was abandoned, but there was something about it, something about the way the shadows seemed to cling to the walls, as if the darkness was alive watching them. Violet could feel the air growing colder, and with each step, the weight of the shadow grew heavier. "We're here," Evan said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "This is where it began." Violet felt a chill run through her body as she took in the church's dilapidated interior. The place seemed to be alive with darkness, a living, breathing entity that surrounded them, pressing in on them from all sides. She turned to Evan, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Evan glanced around, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of the source. "There's an altar. It's where the ritual began. We have to destroy it." They moved toward the altar, its stone surface covered in strange symbols, worn down with age. As they approached, the air grew colder, and Violet felt the shadow watching them, closer now than it had ever been before. It was more than just a presence. It was something tangible, something alive. The moment they reached the altar, the darkness seemed to explode outward, filling the room with a suffocating blackness. The shadow materialized before them, its form twisting and writhing like smoke, its hunger palpable, its cold gaze fixed on Violet and Evan. "You cannot escape me," the shadow whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "You belong to me. You always have." Violet's heart raced as she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her. "No, you don't control me. You don't control anything anymore." Evan stepped beside her, his hand gripping hers. "We won't let you win," he said, his voice filled with unwavering strength. Together, they reached out, their combined will pushing against the shadow's oppressive force. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and the darkness began to ripple and fade. Violet felt the shadow's grip loosening, its form flickering as though it were struggling to hold on. With a final desperate cry, Violet and Evan focused all their energy on the altar, their voices rising in unison as they invoked the strength of their memories, of everything that made them who they were. The altar responded, the dark symbols glowing with a faint light as the ritual was undone. The shadow shrieked, its form dissolving into nothingness, a final, violent exhalation of darkness that filled the room before fading away entirely. The church was silent, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and stone. Violet and Evan stood there, their bodies trembling, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had done it. They had fought the shadow, and they had won. But as the light returned to the world, Violet knew that they would never truly be free. The shadow would always be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. But they had proven something important. No matter how deep the darkness went, they would always find a way to fight back. Together. Chapter 10. A New Reality. The morning after the final stand felt different. The air was clearer, the sunlight warmer, and the weight that had pressed down on Violet and Evan for so long was gone, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. The world seemed to breathe again, as though the earth itself had been holding its breath and was now exhaling a sigh of relief. But even in this new sense of peace, Violet felt an undeniable shift, a quiet dissonance that lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just the shadow that had been defeated, it was the reality they had fought for, the one they knew, the one they had lived in. It had all been torn apart and remade, twisted and bent, as though their victory had come at a price neither of them fully understood. They walked side by side out of the church, their footsteps echoing on the cracked stone floors. There was no more shadow to chase them, no more oppressive presence that followed them in every corner. But something had shifted in the air, like the world had rewritten itself, like the very fabric of reality had been altered in a way that left them unchanged, but irrevocably different. Violet took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. But the moment she did, the world around her seemed to fade, just for a heartbeat. The edges of her vision blurred, the buildings around them becoming vague, indistinct shapes. She blinked, trying to focus, but it was as if reality itself was slipping through her fingers. Evan. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Do you feel that? Evan paused beside her, his brow furrowed. He looked at her with the same concern, his face showing a flicker of confusion. Feel what? Violet looked around them. Everything appeared normal. Too normal, almost. People walked along the sidewalks as if nothing had ever happened, laughing, talking, completely unaware of the terror that had haunted Violet and Evan for what seemed like an eternity. She turned to Evan, her heart sinking. Evan, I think something's wrong. This doesn't feel like it should, like we're not in the right place. Something's different. He stared at her for a long moment, a slow realization dawning on him. His gaze flicked to the buildings, to the people passing by, and then back to her. He swallowed hard. You mean, you think we've changed the world? Or we're not really in it anymore? Violet could feel the trembling in her hands as she clasped them together, trying to steady herself. I don't know, she whispered. But I feel like we've crossed over into something else, something we weren't supposed to see. The air around them thickened again, heavy with a sense of wrongness. Evan stepped forward, his steps faltering as he turned his head toward the distant skyline. There, just on the horizon, was a towering spire that had never existed before, a twisted silhouette that loomed high above the city like a malevolent eye watching them. The sky had darkened in the distance, its colors now muted and strange, as if the very heavens were turning inward. The realization hit them both at the same time. The world around them, the reality they had fought for, was no longer the one they had known. They hadn't just defeated the shadow, they had changed the very fabric of existence, pulling themselves into a reality that was an echo, a distorted mirror of the one they had once inhabited. Violet's heart sank as the pieces fell into place. They hadn't simply broken the curse, they had unraveled the threads of reality itself, and in doing so, They had created a new world, one where nothing was as it had been, and yet everything was strangely familiar. They were still themselves, but they were different, and the world around them, no matter how ordinary it appeared, was not the same. "Violet," Evan said, his voice shaking. "What if this is it? What if this is how the world is supposed to be now?" Violet looked at him, the weight of the question sinking deep into her chest. She didn't have the answers. She only knew that they had fought so hard to preserve their lives, to hold on to their identities, to push back the shadow. But in the process, they had lost something, and in its place was a world that felt both foreign and familiar. One that didn't make sense, that felt like it was on the brink of unraveling again. "We can't go back," Violet said softly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "But we can try to make something of this. We've been given a second chance, an empty world where we can rewrite our story." Evan nodded slowly, his hand reaching for hers, his grip firm, as if that simple touch could anchor them both in this new reality. "But what if," he began, his voice uncertain, "what if the shadow isn't really gone? What if it just changed?" Violet looked at him, and for a moment, all of the fear, all of the confusion she had felt over the past months, disappeared. They had faced the shadow together, fought it with everything they had. But now, more than ever, she realized they had to face this new world, together. The shadow, whether it was truly gone or merely biding its time, wasn't the only thing they had to fear. "We'll face it," she said, her voice steady. "We'll face whatever comes next, together." They walked on, side by side, as the city around them shifted in the twilight. It was a world that no longer felt like home, but somehow it was still theirs. The sky above them grew darker, the silhouette of the twisted spire growing ever closer, and yet Violet felt a spark of determination. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and confusion, but she and Evan would walk it. They would fight for the world they had lost, and the one they would now create. As they moved forward, the world around them seemed to shimmer, its boundaries blurring at the edges, as though it were a dream slowly losing its shape. Violet could feel it, a pull deep within her, a sensation that she had walked this path before, that this was not the first time she had stood here, waiting to take the next step. But now, as they stood at the threshold of this strange new reality, she was not afraid. Whatever came next, whatever dark force threatened to tear apart this fragile new world, they would stand together, unyielding, unbroken. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the last rays of daylight slipped beneath the horizon, Violet took Evan's hand in hers, and they stepped into the unknown. Together. "For a miniban jan noi, ko the Viet Chuong, ten dai hon nua George Kong, ChatGPT janoi, ChatGPT." Absolutely. Here's a further expanded version of Chapter 10. A new reality, giving it more depth and exploring the emotional and psychological aftermath of their battle with the shadow. This version delves into the uncertainty of the world they've created, their lingering fears, and the final resolution of Violet and Evan's journey. Chapter 10. A New Reality. The first thing Violet noticed when she stepped out of the church was the unsettling quiet. The air around her, though still, was thick with an inexplicable sense of change, as if the world itself had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was late afternoon, but the sky, though painted in the warm hues of sunset, seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, as if time itself had been stretched thin, stretched too far. The light that poured from the heavens felt too soft, too muted, like it belonged to a dream. They had defeated the shadow. At least that was what they told themselves. But in the silence that followed, a deep uncertainty began to settle in their hearts. The world was supposed to feel different, wasn't it? They had fought a terrible darkness, had struggled for so long against something that had defined their very existence. But now that it was gone, everything around them felt so wrong. As if the victory they had claimed had come with a cost they hadn't yet fully understood. Violet took a step forward, her feet heavy against the cracked pavement, her pulse quickening as she looked around. There was a familiarity in the air, in the way the buildings loomed above them, the distant sounds of city life that reached her ears. But it all felt out of place, as if she and Evan had somehow stepped into a version of the world that wasn't quite their own, a distorted echo, something that only resembled the life they had lived. "Do you feel it?" she whispered to Evan, her voice barely breaking the oppressive silence. He was walking beside her, but his gaze was distant, fixed somewhere far ahead, as if he too was trying to find a way to piece together the fragments of reality. Evan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "I feel something," he said, his voice low and strained. "But I don't know what. It's like we're in the right place, but something's wrong. It's like the world's holding its breath, waiting." She nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something was wrong. The city around them, once so familiar, so full of life, seemed to have lost its vibrancy. It was as though the colours had dulled, the sounds faded, the people unreal. They walked by without noticing Violet and Evan, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused, as though they were part of the scenery, not truly present in the world around them. "Everything is quieter than it should be," Violet murmured. "It's like we're not even in the same reality anymore." Evan turned his head sharply, his expression serious. "Do you think we changed the world? I mean, when we destroyed the shadow, when we broke that curse, maybe we remade everything. Maybe it's not the same world anymore." The weight of his words sank deep into her chest, a cold stone that pressed down on her heart. The very thought of it made her stomach churn. What if, in their desperate bid to end the shadow's reign, they had inadvertently altered the fabric of existence itself? What if the world they had fought so hard to protect was no longer the one they knew? What if everything, everyone, was just a memory, fading, slipping away? "There's something wrong with the sky," Violet said, her eyes tracing the horizon, where the sunset should have been but wasn't. The light above them had grown dull, streaked with wisps of grey that seemed to stretch across the heavens like the remnants of a long-forgotten dream. "Look at it. It's as if the sun doesn't even want to set, like it's stuck." Evan stepped beside her, squinting at the sky. His gaze shifted from the distant buildings, down to the cracked pavement, then back to the horizon. "It's like the world is in limbo, stuck between something that was and something that's about to be," he said quietly. "And maybe we don't belong here. Maybe the world we're in right now doesn't have room for us anymore." Violet felt her pulse quicken, and for the first time in what felt like ages, the fear that had been quietly gnawing at her began to rise, filling her throat. She turned to Evan, searching his face for answers. He had been her anchor throughout the storm, the one constant she could hold on to. But now, she saw the same uncertainty in his eyes, the same fear she had been trying to suppress. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small, even to herself. Evan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his hand brushing against the rough surface of a nearby wall. He paused, his fingers lingering on the stone, as if searching for some clue, some thread to pull them back to reality. His face was drawn, his lips set in a firm line as he turned to her. "We keep going," he said finally, his voice steady, though the tension in his eyes betrayed the uncertainty he felt. "We keep moving. The world might be different, but we're still here. We're still us." Violet nodded, trying to swallow the gnawing dread that threatened to consume her. Evan was right. They had to keep going. They had no choice but to face this strange new reality head-on. But as they walked through the empty streets, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. It was like walking through an old photograph, one where the edges had started to curl, where the colours had begun to fade. The buildings were familiar, but there was something off about them. The people, though they appeared real, didn't seem to see them, didn't seem to notice them at all. They stopped in front of a park, a place Violet had visited often as a child, where she and her friends had spent endless afternoons running through the grass and laughing in the sunlight. But now, the park was empty. The grass was overgrown, the trees bending at odd angles, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out for something unseen. Violet stepped onto the grass, the dampness of the ground seeping through her shoes, and looked around. The park felt hollow, as though it were missing something vital, something that should have been there. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise, an eerie, mournful sound that echoed across the empty space. "What happened here?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Evan didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the center of the park, his eyes scanning the space as if searching for some explanation. He stopped near the old fountain, the water now stagnant, filled with leaves and debris. The stonework, once smooth and carved with intricate designs, was cracked and weathered, the carvings now unreadable, worn down by time and neglect. "I don't know," Evan said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But it's like everything we knew, everything we loved, is fading. Maybe we've crossed into a place that doesn't have room for us anymore. Maybe this world doesn't care about us." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold, settling around them like a suffocating fog. Violet swallowed hard, but the sensation of dread only deepened. She looked up at the sky once more, the sun's dull glow casting long shadows across the park. It was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to change, for something to give. But what if nothing ever did? "What if we're just ghosts here?" Violet asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop herself. "What if we're already gone, and this is just a reflection of what was? What if we never made it out?" Evan turned to her, his eyes dark with fear, but also with something else, something Violet recognized as determination. "No," he said firmly. "We're still here. I can feel it. You're here. I'm here. And we're still us no matter what happens, no matter how different this world is. We don't just fade away, Violet. We don't let it take us." Violet looked at him, her breath catching in her chest. She felt his words settle deep within her, like the last ember of a fire that refused to go out. They weren't gone. They were still here, and they would fight to stay here, to remain real, to preserve what they had fought so hard to save. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice a quiet whisper but filled with the strength of everything she had left. "Together." Evan nodded, his hand finding hers. The warmth of his touch was a small but vital comfort against the cold weight of the world that surrounded them. They were still here. They were still alive, still fighting. And as long as they held on to each other, they would continue to fight. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. And for the first time since they had broken the curse, Violet felt a glimmer of hope. The world might have changed, but they were still in it, and together, they would carve out their place in it, no matter how much it tried to slip away. And so, with the last light of day fading behind them, they stepped into the unknown. Together, they would face whatever came next. Epilogue. The echoes of tomorrow. The world that Violet and Evan stepped into was not the one they had known, and yet, in its unfamiliarity, it was still their world. The streets, the buildings, the air, they were all different, but they still carried echoes of the lives they had once lived. The faces that passed them by were strangers, yet, in their eyes, there was a flicker of recognition, a shared history they could no longer fully touch. Days turned into weeks, and the strange world around them slowly began to settle into something more familiar. The overwhelming fear, the uncertainty that had once clouded their every step, began to lift. In time, they found new corners of their reality, places that had once been part of the shadows now bathed in light, moments that no longer felt out of reach. But Violet knew that the fight had never truly ended. The shadow that they had battled, the curse that had nearly consumed them, had left scars on their souls, scars that would never fully fade. Yet in those scars, there was a strength that no darkness could ever erase. They had survived. They had endured. And through it all, they had learned that the greatest power was not in defeating the darkness, but in finding the light within themselves, even when the world around them seemed determined to swallow it whole. Together, they had rebuilt their lives from the ruins of the past, forging a new path, one that was not defined by the shadow, but by the choices they made, the love they shared, and the memories they fought so hard to preserve. And though the world around them was uncertain, Though the darkness would always be there, lurking at the edges of their lives, Violet and Evan knew one thing for certain. As long as they held on to each other, as long as they remained true to the essence of who they were, they would continue to fight. They would continue to resist the darkness, no matter how many shadows came. Because in the end, it wasn't the world that defined them, it was the love they held, the courage they found within themselves, and the unbreakable bond that no shadow could ever tear apart. As Violet stood by Evan, looking out at the horizon where the sun rose and set, a quiet certainty settled in her heart. They had faced the impossible, and though they had lost pieces of themselves along the way, they had come out stronger. They had fought for each other, and for a future that was still theirs to shape. And in that moment, they both understood. This was just